Say to my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the Speed Meter Steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. As a young teen growing up in Southern California in the early 1980s, some Saturday nights our family would go out to see the races at the Corona Speedway. This place was insane. A half-mile oval dirt track with a quarter-mile figure-8 track in the middle of it. Some nights they would take pairs of cars, chain them together, and then make them race on the figure-8. Lots of excitement, lots of beer was sold, and getting out of the dirt parking lot after the races was always interesting, with the slightly inebriated fans doing things very stupid with their cars as they left. Unfortunately, the Speedway was closed down in 1984 and no longer exists. Yet in many ways, it was much like the racetracks of over 100 years ago. And what were racetracks like even before then? Let's take a look at the history of the racetrack. Modern car races are held typically on either a racetrack or a race circuit or circuit track. Though many folks use the terms interchangeably, and some modern forums such as the Nürburgring combine the two, they are subtly different. A racetrack is a road specifically built for the purpose of racing. No public traffic can be found on one. The track is only in use when actually racing is taking place. A race circuit is a public road that has been closed off for the purpose of the race. Barricades are erected, bleachers set up, and the local police and emergency medical crews are on high alert for the event. Once the race is over, all traces are removed and the public can use the roads as normal. Race circuits are, as far as we know presently, older than race tracks. There are some depictions and even writings of foot, horse, and chariot racing dating back some 4,000 years or more. These races were held at certain holidays or sometimes to celebrate a military victory over a vanquished foe. Sumerians, Egyptians, Chinese, and other civilizations of the Bronze Age would create a race circuit for the event. The track could be from one city to another or held completely within a large ancient metropolitan capital. The racers would speed by and the spectators would be on the sides of the track cheering them on. Running, riding a horse, or driving a chariot on one of these ancient circuit tracks was not all that different from modern circuit track racing. They were typically not flat, so some changes in elevation were common. Some circuits were point-to-point, while others created a loop so that the same route could be run several times, allowing the racers to run laps. The road being used was not specifically designed for racing, so the participants needed much skill to keep themselves, horses, or chariots from toppling or losing control and possibly hurting other racers, themselves, or spectators. Circuit racing has its specific challenges, and for many fans it's these challenges that make it so exciting. At the same time, a fan of the race can only see a small portion of the track and thus will actually not see most of the action. Also, setting up the track can be quite disruptive to local commerce, with detours everywhere and parts of the city inaccessible for a while. True, the event itself would attract a lot of people and, just like modern race fans, would pay to enjoy the race with a beer or three. However, the raw logistics of managing the crowds, the racers, vendors, and of course the taxes for such events was challenging at best. The concept of a racetrack dates back to at least the 7th century BC. The earliest known racetracks, called hippodromes, were built in ancient Greece and were part of their Olympic Games. These were not oval tracks like we think of them today. Rather, they were like long, skinny U's. The curved side was banked to allow for high-speed turns, while the other end was flat with a marker indicating where to turn. This allowed for laps, and these types of racetracks popped up all over ancient Greece. Horse racing and chariot racing were done in these hippodromes to the delight of racing fans. Large stands for spectators were erected, and to actually see the race, a spectator would need to pay a fee. The higher the fee paid, the better the seat, and some fans would spring for the juicy spots. The turn at the ends of the U, where there was no bank to make it easier to turn a chariot at high speed, is where the real action was. Indeed, at many hippodromes, markers were placed on the track to show where a charioteer lost their life as a reminder of just how dangerous racing can be. And most of those deaths and injuries happened at the flat turn of the track. And if you had the money, you could get a seat there amongst the elite of Greek society and have your beer or wine delivered to you. Within a couple of centuries, the Romans adopted the hippodrome idea and began to build them across Italy and eventually beyond. Yet the Romans did things a bit differently in how they used them. First, they called them a circus. Also, they built them much larger than the Greeks did. The famous Circus Maximus of Rome could seat some 150,000 people. These Roman racetracks helped keep the empire alive for many centuries. Remember, the design of the track means that if you want a good view of the carnage that will ensue, you need one of the seats at the squared-off end of the track. And citizens that had the money would pay mightily for the privilege. To this day, there can be found specific names carved into prime seats at Roman circuses across Europe, attesting to how prized such seats were. Yet in the Roman Empire, you could be flat broke and still get a seat at the circus. You wouldn't be as close to the real action as the aristocracy was, but when you're denarius-less, it'll do. Also, there was food provided for these folks. Bread, either outside the circus or sometimes passed around the stands. Bread and circus was one of the means that the Roman government used to placate their population. The basic principle is still used by many nations to this day. If the people are fed and entertained for free, they will serve their government providers as gods. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, chariot racing fell out of fashion and by the 8th century was pretty much extinct. But the hippodromes and circuses still existed and horse racing continued in them. It was particularly popular in the Middle East where the fast Arabian horses were bred. Such races at this point in time were either on the hippodrome racetracks or were circuit races. It would be another 4 centuries before what could be considered the successor to the hippodrome type racetrack would begin to develop, and it would come about as the result of the Crusades. In the 12th century, many knights and nobles returning from the Crusades brought Arabian horses back with them. These horses were quite fast, but not as hardy as the more stout horses of England and France. So they began to interbreed them to produce horses that were still fast but much more rugged. Horse racing was a sport of the nobility. Public racetracks would not be built until the 16th century. Horse races in England and Europe at that time were private circus tracks set up on their personal estates. Among the first true modern public horse racetracks is the Chester Racecourse in Chester, England. An oval track, it lacks the banks at the turns of the hippodromes and circuses, the turns themselves being much wider and thus not needed. Built in 1539, it is the oldest racetrack of any kind still in continuous use to this day. The overall size and dimensions of this track are the basic standard for flat horse racing across the world, though they did establish the tradition of British horse racetrack to be covered in turf, while elsewhere in the world they tend to be damp clay. Have you ever heard the old toast, "Here's mud in your eye"? This is a very American phrase dating from the 18th century. American horse tracks were muddy dirt and not the groomed lawns that British horses raced on. So when horses were being raced on them, dust, dirt, and mud would fly up from their hooves and sometimes into the faces of the jockeys. So when someone raises their drink and toasts, "Here's mud in your eye," it's actually a somewhat polite way of showing both respect to your opponent and your intention to defeat him. If your opponent has mud in their eye, it's because your horse is ahead of him, and thus you're winning the race. Now let's get to cars. The first races of the late 19th century were conducted on circuit tracks. No racetrack specifically for cars had been built yet. And at first, this wasn't too much of a problem. The cars themselves were not capable of high speeds. However, as we turn to the beginning of the 20th century, cars were much faster, even faster than horses. At the same time, they were hard to steer, had questionable brakes at best, and crowds swarmed the roads to see the spectacle of an auto race. This caused lots of accidents in these early car races, many times being fatal to drivers and spectators. At first, two different methods were tried to alleviate this issue. One was to completely block off the streets of the circuit using local police. The other method was to use the existing horse racetracks. Both proved unsatisfactory. When setting up a circuit, hay bales were the most commonly used to block off the streets. This may keep horses and wagons off of the track, but the bales themselves made for good seating, and there were never enough police to keep spectators from sitting on them. So when a car hit the bales, someone would likely get hurt. For horse tracks, the turns are flat, and once cars could go as fast or faster than a horse, a bank on the turns would be needed or the cars would topple. Also, tires damage a horse racetrack in a way that hooves do not. After the 1903 Paris to Madrid race, in which many lives were lost, most of the automobile racing organizations around the world required reform. Circuit tracks were temporarily banned until more effective methods of managing the course and keeping it safe for everyone involved could be developed. Also, the idea of building a racetrack specifically for cars came to light. The first purpose-built auto racetrack was opened in 1906 in Aspendale, Australia. The track was about a mile long and kind of shaped like a pear. It used crushed cement as a pavement, and the turns were somewhat banked. Later that same year, Brooklands opened in Surrey, England. This track had tall, sloping banks on all of the turns and was paved with concrete. It was the first auto racetrack specifically designed to handle the high speeds of cars and was one of the premier racetracks of Europe up until the beginning of the Second World War. Unfortunately, Brooklands was shut down in 1939 and it was never reopened. One of, if not the, most famous racetracks in the world is the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. This oval-ish 2.5-mile track was first built in 1909 and had high banks on the turns for high-speed racing. Grandstands were placed everywhere, and it can seat over 250,000 people, the largest sports venue in the world to this day. However, the original track was crushed earth and not paved, and the first races proved this to be unsatisfactory. The cars slid all over the place, and several people, both racers and spectators, were killed. So they closed the track and repaved it in red bricks. Reopening in 1911, the racetrack hosted a new race as part of the short-lived International Sweepstakes. This race would become known as the Indianapolis 500, and the track itself, clad in bricks, would gain a nickname, the Old Brickyard. From these beginnings, modern racetracks that we see today were born. And the tracks themselves, be they racetracks or circuit tracks, have been evolving along with the cars that run on them. For the circuit, the host cities have perfected how to keep the track clear and the spectators safe. For racetracks, how to surface them and angle the banks have grown in technology. Of course, both tracks have different characteristics, and the technology of the cars that run on them are also significantly different and developed in different ways. Yet you may still find, tucked away in some corner of the world, an old muddy racetrack where they still chain beat-up race cars together and give the crowds one heck of a night. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.